Oh, thank you so much. It makes me emotional. I'm gonna try up here, but then I may come back down. We'll see. I get a little awkward and anxious. So thanks for having me here today, everybody. I'm excited. This is my first talk since the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm excited, extremely nervous. I do things like this with my hands, so just like ignore me. I have notes, so if I stop and look at them, just give me that bit of grace, okay? I'm getting back into practice. So today I'm going to talk to you about two different studies that I've done looking at different aspects of identity. Yes, I'm a teacher, so I like to do overviews so you know what we're getting into. So we're going to start by talking about what is collective identity, which is sort of the overarching concept that I use with my research. We'll move to talking about the question, who am I, right? Simple question. But we're psychologists. Nothing's ever simple. And then we'll talk about me search and then get into some research and talk about the studies and draw some conclusions and think about that, okay? So let's get into it. First thing is, what is collective identity? Well, collective identity is kind of an umbrella term that is used to encompass a variety of different topics, right? And so it is very flexible, and you can think about it as a way to just understand different aspects of a person, okay? And it just encompasses all these different things. So we can think of collective identity as a statement regarding one's, I have to walk down here because I can't read up there, it's too much. A statement regarding one's categorical group membership. We can also think of it as the context of the beliefs and common characteristics that we share with others within the same category. That can be so broad and cover so many different things. Also, it's important in fulfilling the fundamental need to belong, right? We all know that we have this just inborn, innate need to belong with others, right? And so collective identity is sort of a manifestation of that innate need to belong with others. Now, we all know that need varies, right? Some have a greater need, some have a lesser need, but it's still there, still there. So the topics that I'm talking about in this particular study, and then one I'm not because I just love it, but I wanted to include it in there. For me, I talk about racial identity and identification, falls under that umbrella, as well as sexual identity and identification. And another study that I'm not talking about today, but super fun and cool, I study colorism, right, which is skin tone bias, looking at the bias that we sort of input onto people based on how light or dark their skin tone is. And where all those kind of come together is that, for me, my studies focus on methodology and measurement. Really, what I really want to understand is how we measure things. Or do we have good measures? And if we don't, how do we make them better? Okay? So I was going to do this poll everywhere, but I think what I'm going to do instead of taking time with that, I think I'm going to let people talk. It's more fun, right? So I'm just going to skip this and be like, my first question, it's really small up here, but this one I think I'm going to have you tell to your neighbor. So we're going to talk about the question, who am I? Simple, 3 words, but crazy hard question. So just for a second, I want you to not tell me, but I want you to turn to your neighbor and tell them who you are in 3 words, and then I'm going to ask for 3 people to share. I like to set the expectations. So 2 seconds, turn to your neighbor, tell them who you are in 3 words. Go. Stop. Cease. All right. I told you I want 3 people to share with me, 1, 2, and 3 from each section. Let's jump on it. Do you want me to start a section, or people want to just volunteer?
I don't know if they've heard.
Oh, sorry. Let's get one person from over here. Tell me who you are. 3 words or less. Anybody? I have lots of slides. Yes.
Hello everyone, my name is Cole Wyatt. I am kind, compassionate, and funny.
Oh, nice. Kind, compassionate, and funny. Thank you. Good. Someone over here. Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. Take that to the bank. Yes. One over here. Yes.
Marine, father, and a psychologist.
All right. Marine, father, psychologist. I am tired. Kind, funny, and caring?
I think kind, but either one.
Oh, okay. But yes. So we had different kinds of attributes that we just gave. Some were occupations, some were roles, some were how we were feeling, right? But who initially struggled with that question? Raise your hand. Yeah. Super simple question. Really, really hard. So I had this video. The audio is a little bit weird. I don't know if it'll actually play. But the gist of the video was this individual went to 30 strangers and just asked them the question, who am I? Most of them responded with talking about their occupation, what they did for a living, right? Many of them looked at the person who was just like they were staring deep into their soul, right? Asking, who are you, right? And most of them were just kind of like, here's some attributes I can say about myself. So my question, and asking you, who am I? Oh, it actually did go. We'll watch a little bit.
Okay, so you can answer this however you want, okay? The question for today is, that's a very good question.
Dang, that's hard. I don't know. I'm sorry. I mean, like, I know, but like,
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer that one. I really don't. Who are you? That's a very good question. I'm actually a psychiatrist from Boston.
Okay, so I'm a professional choosing to not to work for a while and traveling around the world. I think that describes how I am today.
I am an old soul who became much younger once I lived on this earth for 60-some years.
who am I?
I love her response. It's a longer video, but you can take it in. But you saw in just those little seconds how varied the responses are. And even the people who gave a response, even a coherent response, still were taken aback for a second by the question. So I was intrigued by that, right? So this can just be a thought question, but think about, why is this question so hard to answer? And people start asking you this question as a child. We look at little kids, right? I have a 2-year-old niece, and I'm like, what are you going to be someday? It's a version of asking, who are you? She doesn't know, she's 2, right? She just likes cocomelon, right? That's just where she's at right now, cocomelon. But why is this so hard? Why do we often answer this with, I don't know? And to this day, my husband the other day was like, you know who you are. And I was like, He's like, yeah, you know. And I'm like, cool, I'm glad that you know that I know. So then the question becomes, why study this question, right? It's super hard. We don't really understand it. So why dig into it? What is there to study? Psychologists, we find a way, right? So I study this because I do me search, right? A lot of people won't say it, right? But most of us do study what we study because we want to learn more about ourselves, right? So why study, for me, why study the question, who am I? Because I'm trying to figure that out. I'm always trying to figure that out. And so for me, understanding who am I led me to thinking about my identity. So what I study, and these 2 studies I'll talk about today, really deal with aspects of my identity. So, no surprise, I'm a black person. Right? What? Yes, I'm a black person. But as I've always been black my whole life, right? But I've not always felt black, right? I grew up in a variety of different spaces, and you know, was called things like Oreo, or told that, oh, you're just trying to be white, or why do you speak like that? Why do you enunciate? My mom's a teacher, and we ran pronunciation drills. That's why I speak this way. But even though I was Black, I often, as a young person growing into adulthood, did not feel Black. So the first day I'll talk to you about is about Black identity, because I was trying to understand, where do I fit? Because that is my dog's seizure medication notification. Sorry. He's with my husband. But I often, you know, didn't feel like I fit. White people were telling me how I didn't fit. Black people were telling me how I didn't fit. And so I just didn't know who I was. But the world treated me like a Black person. The world didn't care what other people thought. It was like, you get racism all the same, right? So trying to understand that. My second study that I did looks at sexual identity of gay and lesbian adults. Now, I personally identify as heterosexual, but I am an ally. And so the impetus for that research was, I was really, really fortunate to spend the bulk of my 20s with a really close-knit group of gay men and lesbians. And they let me into their inner circle and into the deeper part of their lives. And I'm forever grateful for those years I got to spend immersed in the LGBTQIA+ community in the way that I was at that time. I'm still active and I still have lots of friends, but I was genuinely fully immersed in this community as a heterosexual ally. And during that time, I kept looking at my friends who had developed these full, beautiful, strong identities as gay men and lesbians. And I thought, how? How did this happen? Because even though I didn't feel like I fit within Black people, I still knew what it was to be Black because I was raised by other Black people. I was around other Black people. They taught me what it was to be Black. But most people who identify as LGBTQIA+ are not raised around other queer people. They're not raised and grow up in queer spaces. So how do they learn to what their identity is and then how to be proud in that, right? That was a question that I wondered. Also, I wondered, why does our science only talk about queerness as a negative? Why do we focus on the consequences of coming out and what happens and the bad stuff about coming out? Because I have a whole group of friends, they're super happy. They have hardships like everyone else, and they have challenges due to be identifying as LGBTQIA+, but their lives are not doom and gloom, and our science doesn't reflect that. So my research came out of a desire to use the science that I was learning to better understand who I am as a Black person and better understand my queer friends and just put a different narrative in the world about queer individuals. So from that research came the current studies. So these current studies, they're both methodology studies, okay? So if you're just like, oh, can't wait for some crazy findings of like weird, I don't deceive people. I don't do fun stuff like that. I mostly do things like, I have a new way to measure this. Let's see if it's cool, see if it works. Psychometric soundness, that's what I'm about, okay? So these studies had two overarching goals. First goal was to conceptually separate these terms, okay? So you're probably like, okay, how do we go from who am I to identity? Well, for me, the question who am I is just asking about your identity. And if we know anything about identity, identity is just our self-concept, right? And our self-concept is just how we understand and define ourselves, right? So typically in identity research, the terms identity and identification are mashed together. They're deemed synonymous. They always say identity and identification, or identity/identification. But if these were the same thing, why do we have two words? And if we, so I went looking and borrowed from the IO literature, because in IO, these two things are not the same. Organizational identity and organizational identification are defined and conceptualized distinctly from one another. So I said, if they're doing it over here in IO, we should be doing it here. Why is it not happening here? So I took that stance and ran with it. So conceptually, identity really is best understood as representing a description or definition of the individual, like our self-concept, like that who am I, right? Your answer to who am I really speaks to your identity. The second piece, though, is identification. And this is self-reflective and focuses on the degree of incorporation of the group into the self-concept. So identity is sort of the definition, I am this. Identification is the degree to which you would sort of describe yourself in that way, the degree to which you agree that that really is a core part of who you are, okay? You've incorporated that into yourself, right? You can say that I'm a part of these things, but do you feel like they're really a part of, you're really a part of it? So from that, we're going to take that framework of conceptualization, and you'll see it applied to both racial identity and identification and sexual identity and identification. The second piece of this was methodologically distinguishing them, right? So seeing, can we measure these things distinctly from one another? Because again, most measures push them together. So I can define them separately all I want. Do they actually, can I measure them separately from one another? So to do that, I employed a piping methodology. The piping methodology is great. You can do it digitally in a virtual space. You can also do it in paper and pencil, analog, if you will. But essentially what piping does is it's a handy-dandy tool that allows you to ask participants to put in information into one question, and it pipes that information into a later question. So what I asked people to do was tell me what racial or sexual group you're a part of, and then give me 5 characteristics of that group. And then I took those 5 characteristics, pumped that into a later question and said, okay, so you said you're a part of this group. You said these are characteristics of that group. Now, what's the degree to which you would describe yourself in those exact words? And that's what I asked him. That's the whole shebang. And you're like, simple, but genius, all right? So that moves us to the first study. In the first study, we're looking at racial identity and racial identification. Here's a little background info. I just noticed my notes. I'm gonna turn it, just safety net, because we're getting into the hairy stuff. Okay, so that's my awkwardness coming out. So what I did when I looked at the literature for racial identity, there's a lot out there. And I ended up seeing how there were patterns between all the literature and broke them into 3 typologies. The first being ideological models. So ideological models were developed to assess individuals' beliefs, right? Their beliefs about their groups and their beliefs about their group membership. So here they're focused on just thinking, what do you believe to be true about your group? Again, individuals are presented with a measure, with value statements, and asked their agreement or disagreement with those. A great example of an ideological model is Cross's nigrescence model. So that's a great example, as well as the revised versions of the model, but Cross's nigrescence model is a version of that. But the piece that's missing for these ideological models, typically they measure identity, but not identification. So it's a missing piece there. Then you have another typology, racial centrality models. These are identification-focused models. So here we're looking at the flip side. One example is social identity theory, right? Social identity theory really looks at your sort of incorporation or connection to the group, because the idea with social identity theory is that we derive our sense of who we are, our social identity, if you will, from the groups that we're a part of. So it's all focused on identification. You're missing that identity piece. So the third typology of models are multidimensional models. And you think, multidimensional models, we've got everything here, right? They're multiple dimensions. Well, not quite. So these models attempt to, like I said here, attempt to bridge identity and identification. They're trying to meet sort of the gap that the two other typologies miss. A primary example of a multidimensional model would be Seller's multidimensional model, multidimensional inventory of black identity, or the MIBI. The MIBI is great. It has lots of great levels. It covers lots of great things. It is a really nice bridging of these different things, but it doesn't distinguish between identity and identification. So for me, even though the MIBI is a great tool, it really gets in the nitty-gritty and spaces of things, it's still asking people their agreement or disagreement with value statements that are generated by the researcher, and it's still is pulling these two things together as one. And that still, for me, conceptually is problematic. So I was like, lots of good info, love it, but there's work to do here. So this study, these are the distinct conceptualizations that I utilized for this particular study, and they came directly from, they're fashioned after the conceptualizations of organizational identity and organizational identification. So for me, racial identity is defined as perception of essential characteristics that are central, enduring, and distinctive to the racial group. So central, enduring, and distinctive, that directly comes from the Albert and Wetton understanding of, nope, it's Dutton, Duker, and Hartwell, understanding of organizational identity identification. They found that traits or characteristics that are central, which are important, enduring, long-lasting, distinctive, unique to the group are most important. So your identity is comprised of those things that are important, long-lasting, and unique. Racial identification then is the connection in which the person's self-concept contains some characteristics as the racial group. Again, the connection between how you see the group and how you see yourself. Do you feel like you're very close and enmeshed, or super far apart, right? So with this, I used a mixed method design, meaning I collected both qualitative and quantitative data. And the qualitative hypothesis essentially says I'm going to conduct a content analysis to see if there are distinct patterns and trends in the qualitative data that's collected. Remember the piping? I asked them to input the characteristics. That's the qual data. So I want to see if there are patterns and trends, and I'm suggesting that there will be patterns and trends to sort of emerge from that. The quantitative hypothesis, there's a bunch. We'll talk about them each in turn. But essentially, each of the quantitative hypotheses focus on the relationship of racial identity to racial identification, as well as looking at three aspects of validity: convergent, discriminant, and criterion validity. Because it's a validation study. That's what we do. These are the participants. I specifically used a non-college student sample because I wanted to be able to expand beyond the typical age restraints that we have using college student samples. I wanted a bit older sample, and you'll see, thankfully I achieved it. The mean age for this was 32.5 years, so we're getting a bit older sample, which I really wanted. But we see that the income is pretty high, and the median education is pretty high. So it may not be as representative as we want, especially since we're talking about black folk, but we take what we have. It's pretty representative. It was normally distributed. We take it, we go. I did use convenience sampling through my social network, including different social media sites, as well as Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Okay. The procedure was an online study using Qualtrics survey platform, because it was the quickest way to get stuff done. So from that, these are all the measures. I used a variety of different measures. I included aspects of the MIBI for convergent validity. I included identification as well for convergent validity. I included interdependent self-construal as a discriminant validity, and then self-esteem as as criterion, and the AAAS again as convergent, I believe. Yeah, no, as predictive, and then hostility toward whites as predictive. Oddly enough, hostility towards whites didn't really come out at all, so you're not going to see that talked about in the data. It just didn't. So, and then our regular demographics. So, starting with hypothesis 1, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty. We're going to get through this and we can talk about what it all means. So the first hypothesis is looking at the content, the qualitative data. So I ended up with 930 attributes reported from the participants, right? So 5 each, right? 930. So from that, I did an initial analysis where I just organized them, cleaned them up, and put them together. And then I gave them to independent raters to try to sort of, clump them and develop these categories. We had subject matter experts that helped with the organizing of this and sort of pulling together the themes. So first thing I'll say is, oh God, that was my watch, I'm sorry. So many interruptions. So the top 5 most frequently reported attributes from participants were strong, intelligent, beautiful, smart, and proud. Strong, intelligent, beautiful, smart, and proud. That was amazing to me to hear Black people, that the first things that they would say when they describe their racial group are strong, intelligent, beautiful, smart, and proud. That painted a very different picture than what the world had painted for me about how Black people think about Black people or Blackness. And I was like, whoa. And for those to come out as the top 5, and they also came out as a top 5 in a different study with a different sample. So it gave even more credence to the fact that these are really important attributes that Black people think about themselves and their group. And I was like, okay. So from that, we looked and we found these themes, right? So the themes were positive motivation, and that was sort of characterized as words like determined, resourceful, industrious, right? Physical attributes like their full lips and dark brown skin and athletic builds. Intelligence, educated, creative. Familial ties, right? Lots of talk about family, kinship, right? Being loving, being loyal. And then spirituality, religiosity. Very faith-based, religious, spiritual, things of that nature. The 2 things that really sort of stood out to me, that the top theme of overall was positive motivation, like determined, right? Which is interesting because one major stereotype about Black people is that they're lazy. So it was great to see that Black people had not internalized that, right? We don't think we're lazy. The world may say that, but we don't think that. We feel strong, we feel determined. I feel like we can do this. We're industrious, we're getting things done. We're digging in and we're making better lives for ourselves. It's huge. This was so encouraging to see these themes and to see that there are commonalities in the ways that Black people see themselves and see the group. Also, bonus, hypothesis 1 was supported. So I was like, yes. Then we have hypothesis 2. This starts to look at the relationship of racial identity and racial identification. So racial identity was collected, data was collected both qualitatively like you just saw, but also quantitatively through the measurement of central, enduring, and distinctive. So again, those same terms that the individual input in the beginning were piped back into later questions asking how central are these characteristics, how enduring are they, and how distinctive are they of your particular racial group. So we did the initial correlations for these. The correlations came out. They were all significant, p less than 0.01. And so then we're like, okay, all correlated, cool. Let's see which is the best predictor. Turns out centrality is the best predictor, right? Having characteristics that are important or central to the group, having a deep connection with those is more predictive of your level of identification with your racial group for Black individuals. So enduring was, still kind of distinctiveness completely dropped out. So we find that central characteristics most important for predicting racial identification. So if I know the important attributes or characteristics that you feel, those that you feel are important to your group, and you feel like they're important to you, I'm gonna know better your level of identification with your group. So hypothesis 2 was supported. Jazzed about that. I'm sorry, I get very excited because y'all know if you're running data and you're like, it worked, you take everyone you can get. Everyone you can get. So then we move to hypotheses 3 and 4. This is when we're getting into our validity questions, right? We're looking more at the convergent and discriminant validity. So first looking at convergent validity. So what I was looking for were high correlations between racial identification, which is this right column here, racial identification, and the centrality measure, in-group identification, and interdependent self-control, and private regard. Okay, so these are all, I combined some things, but talking about this ISC, interdependent self-control, the centrality, the private regard, as well as these two measures. I don't remember what those are. I don't remember. It's on here. Sorry. Oh no, those are, those are in-group identification. Sorry, in-group identification. The two subscales. So I actually found that pretty much all of them, except for interdependent self-control and this subscale of in-group identification, were all significantly correlated, right? So all but those two were significantly correlated. So we find then that hypothesis 3 is partially supported, right? We didn't get full convergent validity with everything, but it's converging with key measures. So it's doing really what it's supposed to do. It's the apple I made tastes like an apple, right? So we're like, okay, cool. It's maybe a little off of the apple-ness, but it's mostly there. So we move to the fourth hypothesis, which is looking at discriminant validity. And discriminant validity is basically saying that it does not converge with a measure it should not be like, okay? And so it should not be like public regard, okay? Because we have private regard and public regard. It should not be that. And we found, in fact, that's the wrong one. Oh, well, it works. We found, in fact, it's not correlated very much, it's not correlated at all with public regard. So hypothesis 4, so it's converging with what it's supposed to be converging with, and it's not doing what it's not supposed to do, which is great when you're validating a measure because you're like, cha-ching, I made something that's working. So the last hypothesis asks us to look at criterion validity or predictive validity. Is this going to predict what other identity measures and models predict, right? Can it do what it's supposed to do? Really? And I anthropomorphize my concepts. So it was something, Dr. Harvey always, but we digress. So to establish some criterion validity, specifically concurrent validity, the piping measure, the racial identification, will be predictive. I hypothesize they'd be predictive of self-esteem, racial group commitment, and private regard. we see here, looking at, so we first did the correlations and they came out, so we're like, cool, let's move on to the bivariate regressions. We find that for self-esteem and private regard, significant, absolutely it's predicting those, which is exactly what it's supposed to be doing because identification measures do predict those two different concepts. It did not predict commitment, but when I looked back at this, it probably had to do with the scale that I use as a measure of commitment, because the scale I used was not designed to measure commitment, but it looked from face validity, which I talked with Connor earlier. I thought I saw Connor. Oh yeah, Connor earlier about face validity. It was not very, it seemed very face valid, but we all know face validity, you know, you get what you get when you go off of that. So really need to go back to the drawing board, find a different commitment scale, redo it. But for this, we're pretty happy with the fact that the two most important ones to be predictive with, self-esteem and private regard, it did. So partially supported. So from there, just a little bit of recap on this. This study was able to successfully use distinct conceptualizations of these two constructs or two concepts and measure them separately and simultaneously, and was able to demonstrate that they do the same things as far as validity-wise as other psychometrically sound verified identity measures. Also was able to find that there are distinct patterns and trends in the ways that people, particularly Black people, think about their racial group. So, and that's important to me. That first one is really important to me because over the last several decades, we have found that the Black community that was once one and came together has really broken off into different communities. And that would give the idea that there's not as much unification amongst Black people. And this finding really suggests that's not the case. Black communities may have divided and sort of gone into their enclaves, but there is still a core sense of what being Black is and Black identity, and that is ubiquitous across the Black community, across Black people. And we're able to better understand their level of identification and their and how identification impacts their well-being, right? If I know your level of identification, and we saw here that identification is highly predictive of self-esteem, I can have a little bit understanding of how you feel about yourself by knowing how connected you feel to a group you say you're a part of. That's huge. If I can just know from how a part of something you feel, how I can understand if you're feeling okay, that's huge. It's huge. It's really exciting. But I digress. There's lots to go through. And not a lot of time. Oh, Jana told me that. She's like, you have too much stuff, I know. So I'm going to hit the highlights of this study, okay? So for this study, again, took the same framework, but looking at sexual identity and sexual identification of gay males and lesbians, adults, okay? And again, focus this because, like I said, much of the literature does not look at this, okay? Does not look at these different things. So, Jenna's so right, I'm so sorry. So what I did for this study was I developed a model, okay? And this model was trying to understand the relationship between sexual identity and sexual identification and other related concepts, like acceptance. We're back to our characteristics of centrality, our central enduring distinctive, the valence of those characteristics, private regard, which is how you feel about your group inwardly, sexual identification, subjective well-being, which is our satisfaction with life and self-esteem, as well as involvement. There were lots of hypotheses that looked at all of these different things, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna move to the end. How does that feel? Sorry. I grossly underestimated things, but there's the involvement measures. And so I will stop here for 1 second. I did do the qualitative content analysis and actually found I had to split it amongst gay males and lesbians because there were distinct differences in how these two groups sort of talked about attributes and the themes that came out. There were some attributes that were the same, right, that were shared, but some were different, and the terms used within those were quite different. So we see for males, we see positive character traits, right? Attraction and sexuality. Stereotype subcultures, right? Using those sort of stereotype prototypes that are used within that community. And then physical attributes really came out. But this one was really exciting for me. Again, seeing the same kind of trend as we saw with African Americans. For lesbians, we see, again, these positive character traits as well as attraction and sexuality. And again, the embracing of the stereotypes. So again, that was interesting to me to see the embracing of the stereotypes, because again, our culture, our society suggests that these are terms that are used to demean, where the culture and the group inside has internalized them and they're used to identify, uplift, right? So again, turning that on its head. So there's a lot of hypotheses, and I'll just tell you, you'll see which ones worked. So this one, it was only interpersonal acceptance. Intrapersonal acceptance didn't work. Attribute valence totally worked. We see only centrality worked. Again, enduring and distinctive. Distinctive is a dud. Didn't work. It's a dud. So partially supported. We also see looking at that mediation, right? The relationship between private regard and sexual identification. We've seen this before with identity. It worked. That was a significant relationship. So private regard is predicting sexual identification. How you inwardly feel about your group does predict how you, your level of connection with that group. Hypothesis 3. There was so much happening with this one. Again, we see interpersonal being significant, as well as attribute valence being significant with the mediational relationship between interpersonal acceptance to sexual identification being mediated by private regard, and attribute valence being mediated by private regard. But again, intrapersonal is a dud. So here again, we see central attributes being mediated by private regard, as well as enduring attributes, but again, distinctiveness, dud. So even though there were two duds overall, this mediational pathway did come out. So it worked. Our fourth hypothesis, again, was looking at its ability to predict sexual identification's ability to predict outcome variables, particularly self-esteem, satisfaction with life, those are our subjective well-being, and involvement. Now, this is interesting because all three are significant here, right? So we see this hypothesis works. It's predicting all of these. But when you pull in, you try to do it as a mediator, right? When you try to see if sexual identification mediates the relationship between private regard, only self-esteem and satisfaction with life remain. Involvement, again, totally drops out. It doesn't work. And again, I think that's a measurement issue. So partially supported. So all of that comes to this. For my original proposed method, I actually had to take out some different things, and we end up finding that this is the model, the revised model of how external antecedents and dependent outcome variables all relate to sexual identity and sexual identification, okay? Now, I didn't talk about it here, but I did split all of this up for between gay males and lesbians, and yes, there were differences, but that was way too much, even though this was way too much. So what we end up finding with this is that if you feel accepted within your group, right? If you feel accepted within your group, right? That's going to predict how you feel about your group internally, which is going to have an impact on the level at which you identify with that group, which is going to have an impact on your self-esteem and how satisfied you feel with your life overall. Same thing with whether the traits are central or enduring, and with whether you feel like these traits are positively valent or negatively valent. So these 3 antecedents are going to be the most impactful in indicating your level of sexual identification, and that's going to be really indicative of how you feel about yourself and how you feel your life is going, which is huge. It's really important to know. So you're like, why? Why is this all important to know? I'm going to skip past this because these are pretty much the same as the racial identification. It worked. So why? Why is this important? Right? The main findings are there are patterns and trends. We can separate identity from identification both conceptually and methodologically. But the idea is, why do we care? Well, we care because these findings have lots of implications. The main things I could think about with implications were how they can affect I am not a clinician, I'm a social psychologist, but these have very real implications for how you might work with clients, especially LGBTQIA+ or Black individuals. If you understand that how someone feels about themselves, their level of self-esteem, is highly impacted by how they feel about a group they're a part of, a group that's important to them, then you need to, that helps unlock what might be going on with them. If you have a queer person that comes into your office as a client and they're reporting diminished self-esteem, they're depressed, they don't feel good with their life, you might be, this is a signal to say, let's talk about how you feel about your group. Let's talk about how you understand your group. Where do you feel as though you fit? Do you feel like you're accepted? Do you feel like you have friends, right? Do you understand these different things? Also, with Black individuals, it allows you to understand that if they're not feeling a part of that group, then that's going to have ripple effects in other aspects of their life. And that you need to be able to talk about that and allow them space to talk about that and heal from that. So I think this could have implications for clinical practice and therapy. It can have implications for the coming out process for LGBTQIA plus individuals, especially in discovery of themselves. It can have impacts on assessments of self-esteem and depression-related constructs, as well as providing information about the nature of identity and discerning important factors that influence one's understanding of themselves, right? And how they know themselves. It also can increase interest and an examination of intersectionality for minority group members. And one of the things I really love is it challenges this idea of rugged individualism. It challenges the idea that you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that minority groups are not proud, that they don't have things that are important to them, that pull them together, that bring them joy, and that's simply not the case. So concluding thoughts, this demonstrates the utility of collective identity models, as well as presents the utility and versatility of that piping methodology. It also allows for reduced reliance on assumptions and stereotypes in exploring minority group identities because you're getting the information from them. Remember, all of this data started from what they shared about their groups. So for future research, I'm going to continue to use collective identity models to explore my me search, especially since I want to really move into studying fat phobia and body positivity, right? So another aspect of my me search is over the pandemic, I gained like 60 pounds, and that's not fun. And it changes my body, and it changes the way people see me, and I really want to understand fat phobia and body positivity. Why do we hate fatness? Why is that the worst thing? Because I think it's the most insignificant aspect of who I am. And that's where I want to go next with this research. So thank you, Dr. Brummer. Thank you, MSU Psychology Department. Thank you, Dr. Cushion. Thank you, Dr. Hackathorn. Sorry I took all the question time. So we have a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, you are allowed to ask questions.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna fan myself because it's an inferno. Yeah.
Did you come up with the piping thing on your own, or was that like already a thing and you just like implemented it into this? Because it is like really simple but really genius.
Yes, right? Do you want the real answer or do you want me to tell you my answer?
Not the same.
No. So my answer is like, yes, I did. No. The real answer is I actually got the piping methodology. I don't know where it probably actually started off from, but I got it from my advisor at the time, Dr. Richard Harvey. It was something that he'd been playing around with to use in some other identity measures or other identity studies, and we talked about it and we thought this is a great way to adopt it. So that's how I kind of got it, but it's simple. He was using it in a paper and pencil format, an analog, and so we use it digitally with Qualtrics, and it's still great. So good question, thanks for asking. Other questions? Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry, I was like trying to find it, yeah.
So you said about asking the question of who am I, how it's hard or difficult, or it's difficult to answer. So I know a lot of people will ask somebody else, who am I? Whenever they're asked that question, have you looked into that at all?
That's a super good question. No, I have not, but that'd be interesting to, I would be interested to see, particularly with minority groups, how they think other people would answer about them or others in their group, or like maybe a target subject who identifies the same way they do. Right. That would be an interesting sort of way to move into that. I don't know. That would be very, very interesting. I imagine depending on their level of identification, they might sort of project their feelings onto that target other, depending on their level of identification with the group. Really good question, interesting. Others? Yeah. Okay, so good question. Both of these were collected quite some time ago. I'm thinking into my, I believe that data was collected in like 2013, 2014. It's been replicated since then, but that data is not prepared. So it's not used, but this is from 2013, 2014. So I would imagine that the trends might be a little bit different now, but again, this study was like the second or third in a line of studies where we saw the same consistent patterns in the reporting of the qualitative data. So there's not a lot that would make me think that those qualitative data would have shifted significantly. Good question. Yes?
So you said this data was collected in 2013 and 2014. With gay marriage becoming legal in 2015 across the states, do you think that could affect how much characteristics people put in the one end, how it would impact the other end of the model?
Yeah, honestly, what's interesting, I had not thought about that at the time, which I really should have, but I didn't measure that, so I don't know. It could have produced higher positivity in the valence, but I didn't see anything sort of abnormal with that. So I think it's plausible that could have increased identification. I'm talking, in my response to that, I collected some data with a student looking at gay and lesbian individuals' perception of heteronormativity and heterosexuals, and we were able to run that study pre and post the Orlando massacre, and that we did see that there was an impact pre and post from that event. So from that, I would say I might look back and think that could have had an impact, but because I didn't really measure it, I don't quite know. But that's a really, really good question, and that would be something, I would say if anything, I would imagine that might increase positivity, right, in the valence as well as positivity in the attributes. But again, that trend for positivity in the attributes, even though this was the only version of the sexual identity study that I've done, that positivity echoes in the racial identity work, and these are both minority groups that it's very plausible to equate to one another. So one might suggest from that racial identity data that the positivity in the reported attributes is not abnormal, but just consistent with how minority groups see themselves, which is juxtaposed to the negative stereotypes both of these groups face. But good question, good thought. I hadn't thought about that. I actually really want to write that down. Yeah. Just say it however you say it. It's all good.
So I know a lot of people don't define themselves as one group. So like we have queer, I'm mom, a student, like I'm all these different groups. And with the results that you have, like the identification, the stronger the identification, the more self-esteem. So if the stronger identification to all those different groups, would that even raise your self-esteem even more?
So that's a question actually I've had in my mind. I've not studied it, but it's a question I've had in my mind. So if we're talking really about the intersectionality and sort of multiplication or multiplying of identities, and would it allow you to have additional sort of pride or identification with each group? And my initial reaction is probably not. Especially when we're talking about minority status individuals. When we think about individuals who have multiple minorities, it typically creates a more negative impact on them, especially because they're now oppressed from a lot of different sides. So if you think about Black queer individuals, that's two different identities that are minoritized and oppressed. And so high identification in those might produce, high identification in both might produce better self-esteem, might produce better satisfaction with life, but it may not, because now they're competing with two different sources of oppression and discrimination. And we find that it doesn't have an additive effect, it's multiplicative. So it'll be exponential. So that's why I think if we're layering identities that are not necessarily minority status, you may be able to get that. Like if you are white, male, cis, right? You may be able to get that positive building. But when we're talking about minority status individuals, I would think probably no, which feels a little, bleak. But 'tis life. Good question. Good question. Oh, poop. Ugh, other thoughts. Oh, poop.
Yeah, I think it's 6:30 now, so let's say one more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.